As the clock struck midnight, Jacob stepped into the aging, flickering elevator of the abandoned building. The ground floor lobby was eerily quiet, with the usual hum of the city's nightlife barely audible through the cracked windows. He had come here to retrieve something, a small object he'd left behind years ago when he and his colleagues had moved out of the building. The building had been empty ever since, with rumors circulating that it had become a haven for the strange and paranormal. But Jacob had never believed in any of that nonsense. The elevator was an old model, one that hadn't been replaced when the building was abandoned. It had a single button, down. He pressed it without a second thought. The door shut with a metallic groan, and the elevator began its descent into the depths below. Jacob leaned against the wall, arms folded, a frown on his face. He had come down here before. It wasn't supposed to be anything special. At first, the slow, steady movement of the elevator didn't seem out of the ordinary. But as the seconds stretched into minutes, the air inside grew colder, thicker. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, though he couldn't tell why. The further it descended, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The walls of the elevator, once pristine, now seemed to breathe with an unsettling dark energy. Jacob looked at the single button again. Down. That was the only choice. He had expected the elevator to stop at the basement, or at least a floor he recognized. But with each passing second, he felt as though the building itself was pulling him into something far more sinister. It was a sensation he couldn't shake off, a gnawing feeling deep in his gut that told him something wasn't right. As the elevator continued its descent, Jacob shifted uncomfortably. His eyes flicked to the old brass panel in the corner, where once there had been a faint light indicating which floor the elevator was on. Now it was dark, completely blacked out. The only light came from a flickering bulb above. A small sound, like a low thrum, seemed to vibrate from beneath the floor, a sound that didn't belong in a building so old, and certainly not in one so abandoned. The elevator didn't stop. He should have turned back. Jacob had heard the stories, of course. Everyone had. The old building was famous for its bizarre happenings, strange lights, whispers in the dark, objects that moved on their own. But none of that had ever made any sense to him. To Jacob, these stories were nothing more than the ramblings of people with too much time on their hands. Yet, the further the elevator descended, the more uneasy he felt. The temperature dropped another few degrees, and Jacob shivered involuntarily. His breath began to fog in front of him. He rubbed his hands together, hoping to warm them. He stared at the button, the only button, glaring back at him as the elevator descended further. Down! There was a sudden jolt. The elevator jerked violently as though it had hit something. Jacob's heart skipped a beat. He instinctively reached for the emergency stop button, but of course, it was never there. The elevator continued its eerie descent. The hum of the elevator seemed to intensify, reverberating in his skull. A low, grinding sound began to echo from somewhere deep below, like an ancient door slowly opening, or the sound of something moving underground. Jacob gripped the rail with white knuckles, his mind racing. Why wasn't it stopping? Where was the bottom? As if answering his thoughts, the elevator came to a sudden halt. For a moment, there was complete silence. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. He glanced at the walls. Something was wrong. Everything felt off. The space around him seemed to distort, as if the very air had thickened. He could feel the darkness closing in, pressing against him from all sides. His heart pounded in his chest, and he wondered if this was where his story would end. The doors of the elevator remained closed, and Jacob's eyes flicked nervously to the small window in the corner. No lights, no sounds, nothing at all. Then the doors opened. A blast of icy wind rushed in, sending chills through his body. He could barely see through the haze of fog that had filled the room outside. He hesitated, his legs stiff with fear. The world outside the elevator seemed wrong. He couldn't see much, but what he could see was enough to make him question everything he thought he knew. The floor beneath his feet was cracked and uneven, covered in strange markings. The walls were dark, but not with the decay of age. This darkness seemed unnatural, as though it were alive. The air tasted of iron, thick and metallic, and the smell of something ancient lingered in the atmosphere, a smell he couldn't quite place. Something that made his stomach twist and turn. Without thinking, he stepped out of the elevator. His shoes scuffed against the stone floor, and he felt a tremor run through his spine. The faint glow of dim lights in the distance revealed twisted shapes that shouldn't have existed in a place like this. The architecture of the space was alien, as though the building had never been constructed by human hands. It was vast, endless, with high ceilings that seemed to stretch into infinity. There were no windows, no doors, only the winding, endless passageways that seemed to shift and bend unnaturally. Jacob took a step forward, the cold biting into his skin, his breath visible in the air. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Something was watching him, though he couldn't tell what. The air felt thick with a presence, something ancient and unfathomable. His mind screamed for him to turn back, to find his way out, but there was no way back. The elevator doors behind him closed with a soft hiss, leaving him in complete silence. The only sound was the faint echo of his own heartbeat. A distant noise echoed through the chamber. Footsteps, but they weren't his. The steps were slow, deliberate, and closer than he could ever have anticipated. The floor beneath him seemed to hum with a strange energy, vibrating in his bones. Jacob's instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet refused to move. The darkness around him seemed to pull him deeper into its grasp, swallowing him whole. The footsteps grew louder, and Jacob turned toward the source. But there was nothing there, nothing but the cold, empty expanse of the room. Yet the presence remained. It surrounded him, pressing against his chest, suffocating him. And then, as if in response to his fear, the ground beneath him began to tremble. He took another step forward, his mind racing with every terrifying possibility. What was this place? What had he stumbled into? His thoughts spun in chaotic circles as the tremors grew stronger, and then he saw it, a figure standing just at the edge of the dim light. Its shape was indiscernible at first, but as it moved closer, it became clearer. A tall, thin figure, its limbs unnaturally long, its skin as pale as death. Its face was covered by a featureless mask, and its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were black voids, empty and endless. Jacob froze, his body frozen in place, terror seizing his every muscle. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure moved toward him with unsettling grace, its steps soft and measured. As it came closer, the temperature dropped further, and the air grew thicker, with the same metallic scent that filled the room. The figure reached out a hand, and Jacob's heart skipped a beat. In that moment, he understood. This place was not merely a building. It was a prison, a trap for those who dared to enter, a place where time and space ceased to exist, and Jacob had just become its latest prisoner. The air grew colder as Jacob took another step deeper into the room. His breath was now visible, lingering in the frigid space. The faint hum of the place, that unsettling noise that seemed to vibrate beneath his feet, intensified. It was as though the ground itself was alive, resonating with an energy Jacob couldn't comprehend. The darkness pressed in around him, wrapping him in its oppressive embrace, suffocating him with its weight. The figure in front of him remained still, a mere silhouette against the dim light. Jacob's heart raced in his chest, the fear coursing through him like an electric current. His mind screamed at him to run, to escape, but his body was paralyzed, frozen in place, as though some invisible force was holding him captive. The figure took another step toward him. Its movements were fluid, almost unnatural, as if it were gliding rather than walking. The closer it got, the more Jacob felt the temperature plummet. It wasn't just cold now. It was something far worse, an unnatural chill that seemed to seep into his very bones, numbing him from the inside out. The figure was now mere feet away from him, its face still obscured by the featureless mask. Jacob couldn't see its eyes, but he could feel them as though they were boring into him from behind that blank facade. There was something wrong about its presence, something that twisted his sense of reality, making everything around him feel distorted and alien. Without warning, the figure reached out, its long fingers brushing against Jacob's arm. The touch was ice cold, sending a jolt of terror through him. The moment it made contact, the air seemed to grow heavier, more suffocating. Jacob gasped, his breath shallow, struggling to draw in enough air. It felt like the life was being drained out of him, like the very essence of his being was being pulled into the darkness that surrounded them. The figure didn't speak, didn't make a sound, but Jacob could feel a strange force emanating from it. It was like an invisible weight, pressing against him, pushing him deeper into the abyss. He tried to step back, but his feet wouldn't move. It was as if the floor beneath him had turned to quicksand, pulling him down, holding him in place. And then something shifted. The world around him seemed to warp, the edges of his vision blurring and twisting. The walls, the floor, the very air itself seemed to ripple, as if he were no longer standing in the same reality. The figure before him began to fade in and out of focus, its shape flickering like a broken image on a screen. Jacob blinked, his mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. His senses were overloaded, overwhelmed by the sheer strangeness of the place. He couldn't tell if he was still in the building or if he had been transported somewhere else entirely. The boundaries between reality and nightmare were becoming increasingly blurred, and Jacob felt as though he were losing his grip on both. The figure slowly tilted its head as though studying him. The motion was unnatural, its neck bending at an impossible angle. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. He tried to look away, but his eyes were drawn to the figure, unable to break the gaze, as though some unseen force was compelling him to watch. And then it spoke, its voice a low, rasping whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You shouldn't have come here." The words were not a warning, but a statement of fact, a chilling confirmation of something Jacob had already known deep in his gut. He had entered a place that was not meant for him, a place that existed outside the normal laws of time and space, and now he was trapped. Before he could respond, the figure moved again, its long fingers reaching toward his face. Jacob flinched, his pulse racing, but he couldn't bring himself to pull away. The touch was cold, colder than anything he had ever felt before. It was like the touch of death itself, draining him of his strength, his will to fight. He could feel the life slipping away from him, the darkness closing in around him, but there was nothing he could do. The figure's hand lingered on his face for what felt like an eternity. Jacob's vision blurred further, and the room around him seemed to dissolve, melting into a swirling vortex of shadows. He could hear voices now, distant whispers in a language he didn't understand, a language that seemed to vibrate through his skull, filling his mind with images of things he couldn't comprehend. Horrible images, twisted visions of places and creatures that defied description. His knees gave out, and he collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. But the air was thick now, almost solid, pressing down on him with an unbearable weight. His chest felt tight, as though something was squeezing the very life out of him. He wanted to scream, to call out for help, but no sound escaped his lips. It was as if his voice had been stolen from him, leaving him mute in this place of unimaginable terror. The figure continued to watch him, its head tilted at that strange, unnatural angle. It was no longer just a figure. It was something more, something ancient and malevolent, an entity that had existed long before the building itself, long before humanity had even learned to walk. Jacob could feel its presence, its vast, unknowable power. It was the source of the darkness, the force that had dragged him down into this hellish realm. And now that he was here, there was no way out. A sudden noise broke through the suffocating silence, the sound of metal scraping against metal. Jacob's head snapped toward the source, his heart pounding in his chest. It came from the far end of the room, from a shadowed doorway he hadn't noticed before. The door was old, its surface covered in rust, the hinges creaking as it slowly began to open. A low, guttural growl echoed from beyond it, followed by the sound of heavy, dragging footsteps. Jacob's pulse quickened. Whatever was coming through that door was far worse than the figure that stood before him. The darkness seemed to grow heavier, pressing in on him from all sides, urging him to flee, but his body was still frozen, unable to move. The figure before him didn't seem to notice the door, its attention fixed entirely on Jacob. Its hand still hovered near his face, its fingers curling slightly, as though it was savoring the terror that radiated from him. The growl grew louder, and the sound of the dragging footsteps became clearer. The figure shifted, its head snapping toward the door as though it had just become aware of the approaching presence. The door creaked wider, and from within the shadows, a shape emerged. Jacob's heart nearly stopped in his chest as he saw it, a creature unlike anything he had ever imagined. Its body was a grotesque amalgamation of limbs and faces, its skin pale and stretched, its eyes vacant and hollow. It dragged itself forward with unnatural ease, its mouth opening to reveal rows of sharp, glistening teeth. It was a nightmare made flesh, a creature born from the deepest corners of the human mind, something that should never exist in the world. The figure turned toward the creature, its head tilting as if in acknowledgement. The two seemed to communicate without words, a silent understanding passing between them. Jacob's stomach churned as he realized that whatever they were, whatever this place was, it was a realm of horrors beyond comprehension, a place where rules did not apply and the unimaginable thrived. The creature took another step forward, its gaze locking onto Jacob. Its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, revealing even more teeth. Jacob's blood ran cold, his legs finally giving way beneath him. He crumpled to the floor, his body trembling with fear, unable to look away from the creature that now towered over him. The figure stepped aside, allowing the creature to come closer. Jacob couldn't breathe. The creature reached down, its cold fingers brushing against his skin. The touch sent a jolt of electricity through him, freezing him in place. Its grin widened, and Jacob could hear the whispers in his mind, the voices of those who had been here before him, the ones who had never left. "You are ours now," the voices whispered, "forever." The darkness closed in around him, and Jacob felt himself being pulled into it, his body vanishing from the world he knew. There was no escape. There was no light, no hope. Only the endless void of the place that should not exist. And then there was nothing. Jacob's mind was a blur of confusion and fear as the darkness swallowed him whole. The oppressive weight that had pressed against him for so long was now gone, replaced by an unsettling stillness that left him in an eerie state of suspended animation. His body no longer felt real, as though he had ceased to exist altogether. Time and space seemed to bend and twist in ways that defied logic. His thoughts, once frantic and desperate, now echoed in the empty void like a distant, fading memory. But even in the abyss, something remained. A flicker of consciousness, a spark of recognition, and with that spark came the understanding of what had happened. Jacob hadn't been consumed by the darkness. No, he had been transformed. The air, thick with a cold and unnatural chill, seemed to hum with an energy he couldn't understand. He could no longer feel the weight of his own body, nor could he sense the place he had once known so well. The boundaries of his reality had collapsed, and he was no longer the same man who had stepped into that old elevator all those hours ago. A faint glow began to appear, like the soft pulse of a dying star. It was dim at first, barely perceptible, but it grew steadily brighter. The space around him shifted again, pulling him toward the light, and Jacob could feel himself moving, floating, though he had no control over his movements. The air around him began to solidify, and he could sense his body reforming, reattaching itself to the world that had abandoned him. And then the light exploded into full brilliance, blinding him for an instant. It enveloped him completely, suffusing every cell of his being with a new, strange energy. The world he had known, the building, the elevator, the creature, had all faded away, replaced by a realm that was both foreign and familiar. The landscape before him was nothing like the cold, oppressive halls he had been trapped in. It was a place of vivid colors, hues that didn't belong to the world Jacob had once known. Bright greens, deep blues, fiery reds, and warm yellows swirled in patterns that defied the laws of nature. The ground beneath him was no longer stone or metal, but soft and yielding, like a field of flowers that bloomed in every direction. The air was thick with the scent of something sweet, something rich, like freshly blooming jasmine mixed with the earthiness of wild grass after a summer rain. Jacob blinked, trying to make sense of his surroundings. But it was as if the world itself was shifting with every passing second. The colors seemed to ripple like waves on the surface of a pond, creating patterns that made his head spin. He felt like he was caught in some sort of cosmic dance, spinning between dimensions, unable to find his footing. The space around him was vast, stretching far beyond the horizon. In the distance, he could see figures moving, creatures that glided through the air with a strange elegance, their bodies shimmering in the light. They were unlike anything Jacob had ever seen, with features both human and alien, as though they were the embodiments of some primordial dream. They didn't seem to notice him, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Jacob felt a fleeting sense of peace. It was then that he realized something. He wasn't alone. The figure with the mask, the one that had first touched him, was standing before him, its form clearer now than it had been in the darkness. It no longer looked threatening, nor did it seem malevolent. In fact, it was as though the very nature of the figure had shifted along with the world around it. Its mask, once smooth and featureless, now held an intricate design, curved lines and patterns that glowed faintly with a soft light, almost as though the mask were alive. Its eyes, or where its eyes should have been, were now visible. Deep, endless black pools that seemed to hold the entire universe within them. The figure's long, spindly fingers were no longer threatening. Instead, they reached out, gently touching Jacob's arm with an odd sense of comfort, as if it were offering him understanding, not fear. "You have crossed the threshold," a voice, soft and ethereal, whispered into his mind, resonating deep within his soul. "You are no longer bound by the constraints of your old world. You have been chosen to witness what lies beyond, to understand the truths that elude your kind." Jacob tried to speak, but no words came. It didn't matter, for the figure's presence was soothing now, like a guide, leading him through a world that was foreign, yet somehow familiar. He felt no fear, no panic, only curiosity. "Where am I?" he thought, his mind struggling to articulate the question. The figure gestured toward the swirling horizon, the colors shifting around them in response. "This is the space between worlds," it replied, its voice vibrating through the very fabric of Jacob's being. "A place of transition, a place where time and space converge and collapse. This is where all things begin and end, where all souls must pass when they are called." Jacob stared at the expanse before him, trying to process what he was hearing. He was no longer in the building, that much was certain. But where was he? Was this a dream, a purgatory, some kind of afterlife? "You are here because you sought the unknown," the figure continued, its presence now a comforting weight in Jacob's mind. "And now you are part of it. You will no longer remember the world you came from, nor will you remember your past life. That life is gone. You have transcended it. You are something new. Something new." The words echoed in Jacob's mind like a distant chime. As the figure spoke, the strange creatures in the distance moved closer, their shapes becoming clearer. They were beings of light and shadow, their forms shifting constantly, never fully materializing into anything solid. They hovered near Jacob, each of them radiating an energy that felt both familiar and alien, like ancient beings that had always existed just beyond the reach of human understanding. The figure looked down at Jacob, and for the first time, its mask seemed to soften, the lines on its surface shifting with a sense of gentle empathy. "Do you understand now?" it asked, its voice a soft hum. Jacob nodded slowly, a deep sense of awe rising within him. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he felt the truth of it, an undeniable certainty that he had crossed into something beyond human comprehension. This place, whatever it was, held no answers, no clear directions. It simply was. And now he was part of it. The creatures, with their shimmering forms and glowing eyes, surrounded him. They moved around him in a spiral, their movements fluid and graceful, as though they were performing some kind of ancient ritual. The air grew thick with energy, and Jacob could feel his body tingling, alive with a new power, a new awareness. He was no longer a man in an elevator, lost in a forgotten building. He was something else now, something untethered to the world he had known. The figure took one final step back, its long fingers lifting to the sky. A wave of light erupted from its form, spilling outward like liquid fire, filling the expanse with warmth and brightness. The creatures joined in, their bodies merging with the light, becoming one with the pulse of energy that flowed through the air. The colors that had once swirled in the distance now blossomed, brighter and more vivid than ever before. The ground beneath Jacob's feet seemed to hum with life, as if the very earth was breathing in rhythm with the cosmic dance unfolding around him. Jacob felt himself being lifted, not physically, but spiritually, his mind and soul expanding with the energy around him. He was no longer confined to the limitations of his past self. The boundaries of his existence had dissolved, and he was one with everything, the creatures, the light, the colors, the energy that pulsed through the very fabric of this strange and beautiful place. "You are free now," the figure's voice whispered, not just in his mind, but in the very core of his being. "Free from the chains that bound you to your former world. You are part of the eternal cycle, a part of the cosmic dance that never ends." And with those words, Jacob felt himself merge with the light, his consciousness becoming part of something greater than himself, something beyond time and space. The boundaries of his individuality vanished, and he became one with the endless expanse, floating freely in the ever-shifting cosmos, where no beginning and no end existed. The figure, now nothing more than a fleeting memory, faded into the light, leaving Jacob to dissolve into the eternity of this strange and beautiful place. And as he faded, he finally understood. There was no ending, no finality. There was only the infinite cycle, the dance that went on forever, with no beginning and no end. He was part of it now, forever.